The shimmering obsidian, Tokyo Bay at first light. April 7th, 1945. The world is held in a state of violent transition. Over the dark, shimmering obsidian waters of Tokyo Bay, the final year of the Second World War is reaching a fever pitch. As the first tentative rays of the morning sun begin to bleed over the Pacific horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and pale golds, the air itself begins to change. For centuries, the Japanese home islands were protected by the vastness of the sea, a geographic fortress that had thwarted invaders since the days of the Mongol Empire. But this morning, that ancient protection has evaporated. A low, rhythmic thrum begins to vibrate through the atmosphere, a deep bass resonance that rattles the windows of coastal villages and disturbs the morning stillness of the imperial capital. It is a sound the Japanese people have never heard before, not the heavy, lumbering drone of the four-engine B-29 bombers they have come to fear, but something sharper, more aggressive, and terrifyingly fast. The arrival of the sunsetters. Emerging from the silver morning haze, like a phantom fleet materialized from the sea, are 91 North American P-51D Mustangs. These are the sunsetters, the elite aviators of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups. They represent the spearhead of the 7th Fighter Command, and their presence here is a miracle of logistics and engineering. This is no mere routine patrol or localized skirmish. It is the opening movement of a strategic revolution that has fundamentally rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. To the Japanese commanders on the ground, the sight is a physical impossibility. Their radar operators and intelligence officers had long calculated that no single-engine fighter in the American arsenal possessed the legs to cross the 750-mile void of the Pacific from their island bases. Yet here they are, nearly 100 American hunters, their polished aluminum skins glinting like diamonds in the rising sun, flying over the very heart of the empire. Inside the glass bubble, Major James B. Tapp. Inside the cockpit of his Mustang, Major James B. Tapp is a study in focused intensity. He sits encased in a plexiglass bubble, the iconic teardrop canopy that provides the 360-degree visibility necessary for survival in a high-G dogfight. He adjusts his rubber oxygen mask, the hiss of the regulator the only sound in his ears besides the roar of the Merlin engine ahead of him. His eyes are a constant blur of motion, flicking from the horizon to his instrument panel, checking the manifold pressure, the oil temperature, and the fuel gauges that have been his lifeline for the last several hours of flight. Major Tapp is not just a pilot, he is the operator of a masterpiece of industrial destruction. Beneath the wings of his Mustang, he carries the literal weight of American manufacturing supremacy. His wings are heavy with 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, belt-fed and synchronized to create a wall of lead. The mathematics of destruction, 2,080 rounds. These early D models are uniquely lethal. Each of the inboard guns is fed by a cavernous ammunition box containing 500 rounds, while the center and outboard guns carry 270 rounds each. This brings the total to a staggering 2,080 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. This was the era of saturation fire. Each trigger pull releases a stream of white-hot kinetic energy capable of penetrating engine blocks, shredding wing spars, and igniting the self-sealing fuel tanks of any aircraft that dares to cross his sights. Later in the war, the Army Air Force would reduce this ammunition load to 1,880 rounds to improve the reliability of the feed chutes, but on this April morning, Tapp and his fellow pilots are flying with every ounce of firepower the airframe can support. They are carrying enough lead to derail a supply train or turn a Japanese interceptor into a falling pyre of scrap metal in a matter of seconds. The sentinel of the empire, Mount Fuji. To the pilot's left, rising out of the mist like a titan from another age, stands Mount Fuji. Its iconic snow-capped cone is etched sharply against the clear morning sky, silent and indifferent to the machinery of war buzzing around its flanks. To the Japanese, Fuji is a sacred symbol of national identity and divine protection. But to the American pilots, it has been stripped of its mysticism and reduced to a vital navigational waypoint. It is their stationary lighthouse. After flying 750 miles over a featureless yawning ocean, where a 1-degree error in navigation meant a watery grave, the sight of Fuji's peak is a psychological anchor. It confirms they have found their mark. It tells them they are exactly where the commanders said they would be. The end of isolation. Below the formation, the Japanese countryside unfolds like a delicate silkscreen painting. A patchwork of emerald green rice fields, tiny wooden villages, and meticulously kept military installations pass beneath their wings. For nearly 3 years of total war,
this landscape had remained largely insulated, a sanctuary where the direct violence of the front lines felt worlds away. But as the shadow of the Mustang sweeps across the hills of Honshu, that insulation is vanishing forever. The divine wind that once protected Japan has been replaced by the scream of the American supercharger. The dawn of the impossible has arrived, and by the time the sun sets this evening, the myth of the Japanese home island's invulnerability will be nothing but smoke and ash.
The impossible calculus of 1943. To understand the magnitude of what was occurring on April 7, 1945, and dismissed the idea of single-engine fighter escorts for Tokyo as a fever dream, a logistical and physical fantasy. In Europe, the P-51 Mustang had already achieved legendary status by escorting bombers to Berlin, but that was a mission flown over land, with emergency airfields scattered across occupied territory and a return trip of roughly 500 to 600 miles. The Pacific was a different beast entirely. Here, there were no landmarks, no emergency strips, and no room for error. The distance from the scarred volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, a base only recently and bloodily captured, to the heart of the imperial capital was 750 statute miles. Pushing the laws of physics. For a single-engine aircraft to fly a 1,500-mile round trip over the world's largest and most unforgiving ocean was a feat that pushed the laws of physics and the limits of human endurance to their absolute breaking points. It required a delicate, dangerous dance of fuel management. The Mustangs were forced to carry massive 110-gallon external drop tanks under each wing, adding immense drag and weight that made the aircraft sluggish and vulnerable during the initial climb. The pilots had to lean out their engines to the point of stalling, coaxing every possible mile out of every drop of 100-octane fuel. They were flying on the razor's edge. A single mechanical hiccup, a slight headwind, or a navigational error of just a few degrees would mean the engine would sputter and die over a featureless blue abyss hundreds of miles from the nearest rescue ship. 0700 hours, the radar panic. As the clock strikes 0700 hours, the atmosphere inside the Japanese Air Defense Command Centers shifts from routine alertness to panicked disbelief. On the phosphor screens of the Japanese radar network, a massive silver cloud of B-29 superfortresses is detected. The Japanese had become tragically familiar with these high-altitude giants, the Bisan as they called them. They knew the bombers were formidable, but they also knew they were lumbering and vulnerable to determined high-altitude interception. Commands are barked into radios, and across the airfields of Kanto, Atsugi, and Yokosuka, more than 100 interceptors are scrambled into the sky. The Japanese pilots, many of them young, inexperienced, and fueled by a desperate sense of duty, bank their aircraft into steep climbs, firewalling their throttles to reach the bomber's cruising altitude. They expected to find the usual defensive boxes of B-29s, bristling with remote-controlled turrets, but ultimately flying alone. The chilling silhouette. But as the Japanese interceptors level off and begin their attack runs, the sun catches a series of flashes that shouldn't be there. They see small, sleek, and terrifyingly agile silhouettes weaving through the bomber formation like wolves among a herd of whales. Single-engine American fighters. The sight chills the Japanese pilots to their very marrow. The psychological shock is not just immediate, it is paralyzing. For months, the Japanese High Command had engaged in a campaign of domestic propaganda and military assurance, telling their pilots and the public alike that American fighters lacked the legs to reach the homeland. They were told the capital was a sanctuary that no American single-engine plane could ever violate. The shattered sanctuary. The appearance of the Mustangs was a visible, screaming refutation of everything they had been told. These were not the Navy's F-6F Hellcats or F-4U Corsairs launched from carriers. This was something far more permanent. These were the Sunsetters of the 7th Fighter Command, land-based Army Air Force fighters that had somehow conquered 750 miles of open water to appear over the Emperor's palace. They weren't just here to defend the bombers, they were here to seize the sky. In that single, terrifying moment of recognition, the Japanese pilots realized that their tactical advantage had evaporated. The American industrial machine had not just produced a long-range fighter, it had produced a machine that had effectively turned the Pacific Ocean into an American lake. The sanctuary of the home islands was gone, replaced by a battlefield where the most lethal air superior fighter in existence now roamed with total impunity. The search for a heart. The dominance of the P-51D Mustang over the skies of Tokyo was not a result of fortune or mere chance. It was the crowning achievement of one of history's most successful, albeit desperate, international collaborations. In its early life, the Mustang was a good aircraft, but it was not yet great. Born from the design boards of North American Aviation for a British export contract, the original airframe was mated to an Allison V1710 engine. While the Allison was reliable, it lacked a high-altitude supercharger, meaning that above 15,000 feet, the Mustang lost its breath and its lethality. The turning point, the moment that changed the trajectory of the air war, occurred when British engineers made a radical suggestion: remove the American engine and transplant a British heart. This heart was the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that had saved the United Kingdom during the Battle of Britain. The result was a sublime marriage of American aerodynamic innovation and British reciprocating engine perfection. The American powerhouse, the Packard V1650-7. To meet the staggering demands of global production, the task of mass-producing the Merlin was handed to the Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit. The result was the Packard V1650-7, a 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled masterpiece that would become the definitive engine of the P-51D. This engine was a marvel of 1940s metallurgy and precision. At takeoff, it roared with 1,695 horsepower, but its true capability was hidden behind a wire-locked gate on the pilot's throttle quadrant. In moments of extreme peril, when a pilot was engaged in a life-or-death struggle with a Japanese interceptor, he could break the safety wire and push the throttle into the emergency war power notch. This activated a water methanol injection system, which cooled the intake charge and allowed the engine to scream at a terrifying 1,720 horsepower for short bursts, giving the pilot an extra gear that few enemies could match. The secret of high-altitude supremacy: two-stage compression. However, the real magic that separated the Mustang from every Japanese fighter it encountered lay in its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. This was the mechanical brain that allowed the Mustang to dominate the thin, freezing air of the stratosphere. As the Mustang climbed toward 30,000 feet, where the air is only a fraction as dense as at sea level, most engines began to choke, but the Merlin supercharger functioned like a mechanical lung. The first stage would draw in the thin air and compress it. This process generated immense heat, which would normally cause the engine to detonate. To solve this, the air was passed through an intercooler, an aftercooler in some configurations, to shed its thermal energy. Finally, the second stage would compress the cool, dense air even further before shoving it into the cylinders. The stratospheric predator. This dual-stage process meant that the Mustang's engine could breathe with the same depth at 30,000 feet as it did at sea level. In contrast, the Japanese engines, primarily the Nakajima Homare, were equipped with primitive single-stage superchargers. As the Japanese pilots tried to climb to intercept the B-29s, their engines were literally suffocating, losing power and torque exactly when they needed it most. They became sluggish, their controls feeling like they were moving through molasses. The P-51D, however, remained a nimble and aggressive predator. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang could hit a blistering 440 miles per hour, an altitude and speed where it was virtually untouchable. It could dive from the heavens, strike with surgical precision, and use its superior power-to-weight ratio to zoom climb back into the sun before the Japanese pilots even realized they were under attack. This mechanical advantage transforms the sky into a vertical playground for American pilots, leaving the Japanese defenders to struggle for oxygen and airspeeds in the killing zones below.
The theoretical terror, the K-84 Hayate. Rising from the scorched runways of the Kanto Plain to meet the American onslaught was the Nakajima K-84 Hayate, an aircraft known to Allied intelligence by the code name Frank. On the drafting tables of Nakajima's engineers, the Hayate, meaning gale or storm, was designed to be the ultimate answer to Western aviation. It was intended to be the Mustang killer. In terms of pure design, the Frank was a formidable, world-class opponent. It was arguably Japan's fastest and most sophisticated fighter of the entire conflict, specifically engineered to possess the high-altitude performance of the P-51 and the rugged, heavy-hitting durability of the P-47 Thunderbolt. At its core sat the Nakajima Homare 45, an 18-cylinder twin-row radial engine that was a masterpiece of compact power, theoretically capable of screaming at a monstrous 2,000 horsepower. A victim of a dying empire. However, the Frank that flew over Tokyo in April 1945 was a ghost of the aircraft its designers had envisioned. While the American Mustang was a product of the arsenal of democracy, built with the relentless consistency of a Swiss watch and the infinite resources of Detroit, the K-84 was a victim of a dying, besieged empire. By 1945, the Japanese industrial base was in a state of terminal collapse. To escape the relentless firebombing raids of the B-29s, much of the Hayate's production had been moved into clandestine underground factories and makeshift workshops hidden in the mountains. The skilled master craftsmen who had built the Zero at the start of the war were gone, dead at the front, or replaced by a desperate workforce of high school students and conscripted laborers who had never held a rivet gun before. The result was a tragic lack of quality control. No two Hayates were identical, and many rolled off the line with misaligned flaps, leaking fuel lines, and structural defects that made them as dangerous to their pilots as they were to the enemy. The desperate alchemy, fuel and fire. The technical disparity was nowhere more apparent than in the fuel tanks. The Homare engine was a high-strung, high-compression thoroughbred that required 100-octane aviation gasoline to function at its peak. But by 1945, American submarines had severed the oil lifeline from Southeast Asia, and Japan's refineries were smoking ruins. Japanese pilots were forced to fly with 87-octane fuel, or even lower grades, which were stretched through a process of desperate alchemy. Scientists attempted to synthesize fuel from alcohol distilled from sweet potatoes or oil extracted from pine tree roots. This low-grade, volatile cocktail was a death sentence for the Homare engine. It caused massive knocking or pre-ignition, where the fuel would explode prematurely in the cylinders, shattering pistons and causing the engine to overheat and seize during high-power combat maneuvers. American pilots often reported seeing Japanese fighters suddenly erupt in black smoke or lose power and fall out of the sky before a single shot was even fired. Brittle steel and buckling gear. Even if the engine held together, the very bones of the aircraft were failing. The collapse of the Japanese steel industry meant that the precise heat treatment processes required to harden metal had been abandoned. The steel used in the landing gear struts of the K-84 became brittle and soft. This resulted in a terrifying epidemic of landing gear failures. A pilot could survive a harrowing dogfight against Mustangs, only to have his gear buckle upon touchdown, flipping the aircraft and crushing the pilot inside. Japan was losing precious aircraft and even more precious pilots on their own runways, writing off machines they could not replace due to metallurgy that simply wasn't up to the task of modern war. The K-84 Hayate was in every sense a gale of desperation. It was an aircraft that possessed the spirit of a samurai, but was trapped in a body of decaying iron and fueled by the dregs of a broken economy. It stood as a testament to the fact that in the age of industrial warfare, even the most brilliant engineering and the most fanatical courage cannot survive when the factories that sustain them have turned to ash.
The philosophy of the sting. In the high-stakes arena of a 400-mile-per-hour dogfight, the superior aircraft is only as good as its ability to project lethal force at a distance. The disparity between the American and Japanese forces extended far beyond engine horsepower or wing design. It was etched into the very brass and lead of the rounds being fired. While the Japanese air defense relied on the heavy punch of slow-firing cannons, the United States Army Air Forces adopted a philosophy of overwhelming volume and surgical reliability. The hammer of the arsenal, the M2 Browning. The primary weapon of the P-51D Mustang was a battery of 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. To the uninitiated, a machine gun might seem less impressive than a cannon, but the M2 was the hammer of the arsenal. These guns were synchronized and harmonized, their fire adjusted so that the streams of lead converged into a single devastating killing zone approximately 250 to 350 yards ahead of the nose. When the pilot squeezed the trigger on his stick, he wasn't just firing a gun, he was unleashing a ballistic symphony. The 6 Brownings fired at a combined rate of 4,800 rounds per minute. To visualize that scale, that is 80 rounds of heavy lead leaving the wings every single second. The physics of the API round. The ammunition itself was a marvel of destructive chemistry. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary API round. Each individual round weighed 46 grams and left the muzzle at a staggering velocity of 2,900 feet per second. The math of this kinetic violence was terrifying. Because kinetic energy increases with the square of velocity, these rounds didn't just dent metal, they shattered it. When a burst from a Mustang hit the thin, unarmored duralumin skin of a Japanese fighter, the API rounds performed 2 distinct tasks. First, the hardened steel core punched through engine blocks, propeller hubs, and pilot armor like a hot needle through wax. Second, the incendiary chemical tip ignited upon impact, turning the high-octane fuel vapors inside Japanese wings into an escapable furnace. A 2-second burst was often enough to saw a wing clean off or turn a K-84 into a tumbling fireball.
The Japanese dilemma: power versus persistence. Rising to meet this was the K-84 Frank, armed with a mixture of 20mm Ho-5 cannons and, in some variants, massive 30mm Ho-155 cannons. On paper, a 30mm shell carries far more explosive power than a .50 caliber bullet. A single hit from a Japanese cannon could theoretically down a Mustang. However, this power came with a fatal systemic flaw: ammunition capacity. A Japanese pilot typically went into battle with only a total of 400 rounds for his entire mission. In the chaos of a high-G dogfight where the target is visible for only a fraction of a second, 400 rounds could be exhausted in a few desperate bursts. The Japanese pilot was forced to exercise extreme trigger discipline, often hesitating to fire until he was at point-blank range, a range he rarely reached because he was being peppered by American fire from hundreds of yards away. Ranging bursts versus the rainbow trajectory. The Mustang pilot, carrying a cavernous load of 2,800 rounds, had nearly 5 times the persistence of his adversary. This allowed for a tactical luxury known as the ranging burst. An American pilot could afford to spray a lead-in stream of fire to see where his tracers were falling, adjusting his aim in real time until he walked the fire onto the enemy's cockpit. Furthermore, the .50 caliber round had a much flatter ballistic trajectory. It flew straight and true over long distances. The Japanese cannons, particularly the 30mm, had a much lower muzzle velocity. Their shells follow a rainbow arc, dropping rapidly due to gravity. In a turning fight, a Japanese pilot had to lead his target by a massive margin, guessing the drop of his heavy shells. The American pilot simply had to point and shoot. This difference in ballistics meant that the Mustang could effectively engage and destroy targets at 400 to 600 yards, while the Japanese pilot was essentially toothless until he closed to within 200 yards. The mathematics of firepower ensured that by the time the Japanese pilot was close enough to use his cannons, his aircraft had already been perforated by hundreds of rounds of American API.
The 600-hour investment. The American training pipeline. In the cold, clinical logic of total war, an aircraft is merely a tool. The true weapon is the mind behind the stick. By 1945, the disparity between the men in the cockpits had become as vast as the Pacific itself. When a P-51D pilot arrived at the volcanic ash airstrips of Iwo Jima, he was not a novice. He was a highly refined product of the most expensive and comprehensive training pipeline in human history. The average American pilot had logged a minimum of 600 hours of flight time before ever seeing a combat zone. His journey began in primary trainers, progressed to advanced Texan aircraft, and culminated in dozens of hours in the Mustang itself. He didn't just know how to fly, he knew how to fight. He had spent hundreds of hours practicing deflection shooting, the difficult art of leading a moving target on sleeves towed by other aircraft. He had mastered the Link Trainer, an early flight simulator that taught him to fly by instruments alone in total darkness or heavy cloud. By the time he crossed the Japanese coast, the Mustang's cockpit was his second home, and its limits were etched into his muscle memory. The tragedy of the 50-hour pilot. On the opposite side of the horizon, the situation was nothing short of catastrophic. By the final months of the war, the veteran Japanese aces of the Midway and Solomon Islands era were largely gone, their expertise buried in the jungles or lost at sea. To replace them, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were forced to cannibalize their own future. By 1945, a Japanese replacement pilot was lucky to have 50 total hours of flight time. These boys in the cockpit were rushed through basic maneuvers and sent into the most high-stakes aerial theater on Earth. The training was so truncated that many were sent into combat having never once fired their cannons in a live-fire exercise. Ammunition was so critically scarce that it was considered a waste to use it on practice targets. It was saved for the one final shot at a B-29. These pilots weren't being trained to win. They were being trained to die with honor, often lacking the basic skills to perform high-G evasive maneuvers without stalling their engines or spinning into the sea. The safety net, the lifeguard network. Perhaps the most significant difference between the two forces was not found in the air, but in the water beneath them. For an American pilot, a mechanical failure 500 miles from base was a crisis, but it wasn't necessarily a death sentence. This was thanks to the lifeguard system, a massive, hidden infrastructure of rescue. Every very long-range VLR mission was shadowed by a fleet of submarines, stationed at intervals of approximately 50 miles along the entire flight path. These Lifeguard League subs sat on the surface, their crews scanning the skies for parachutes. Overhead, PBY Catalina Dumbo flying boats and SB-29 Superfortresses carrying droppable lifeboats circled the route.
This system provided more than just physical safety. It provided moral courage. An American pilot knew that if he pushed his Mustang to its absolute limit, if he dove into a swarm of enemies, or if his Merlin engine finally gave out, there was a high probability that within minutes, a rescue boat or a submarine would be there to pluck him from the waves. This allowed for a level of aggressive, confident flying that the enemy could not match. The fatalism of the defender. In stark contrast, the Japanese pilot operated in a vacuum of hope. There were no Japanese rescue submarines. There were no Dumbo flying boats waiting to save them. The Japanese military culture of the time viewed the idea of being rescued from the sea with a mixture of indifference and shame. A Japanese pilot knew with absolute chilling certainty that if he went down in the Pacific, he was a dead man. He flew his mission with the fatalism of a ghost. This lack of a safety net led to a different kind of psychology, one that favored the desperate, suicidal kamikaze stripe over the calculated tactical aggression of the professional aviator. While the American pilot fought with the intent to return and fight again, the Japanese pilot was increasingly viewed by his own command as an expendable component of the machine. This invisible advantage meant that every American pilot was a long-term investment that grew more experienced with every mission, while the Japanese force was a dwindling resource, spiraling towards total exhaustion.
The Bloody Ledger, April 7th and beyond. The mission on April 7th, 1945, was far more than a tactical success. It was a prophetic demonstration of the end of the war. When the P-51s finally touched back down on the volcanic ash runways of Iwo Jima, the debriefing reports revealed a slaughter. The Sunsetters of the 7th Fighter Command officially claimed 26 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with several more listed as probables. The cost to the Americans? Just 2 Mustangs. One pilot was lost, and the other was rescued from the sea, a testament to the lifeguard system already in place. This 13-to-1 kill ratio was merely the beginning. As the weeks turned into months, the disparity grew from a gap into a canyon. By the summer of 1945, the kill ratios had skyrocketed to an unthinkable 30-to-1. The Japanese Air Force was no longer a defending wall, it was a crumbling ruin. American pilots began to report target-poor environments, where they would circle Tokyo for hours, hunting for any aircraft bold or desperate enough to take flight. The industrial hammer. By June and July of 1945, the Japanese Air Force had essentially ceased to exist as an organized, cohesive fighting force. The Mustang had achieved something rarely seen in the history of warfare. It had broken both the industrial back and the psychological spirit of an entire nation's defense. The Mustang didn't just win dogfights, it enabled the total destruction of Japan's infrastructure. With the P-51 sweeping the skies clear of interceptors, the B-21 superfortresses were free to descend from their high-altitude perches. They began to conduct precision daylight raids at lower altitudes, where their bombing accuracy tripled. The Mustang was the key that unlocked the door to Japan, allowing the American industrial hammer to fall with surgical, devastating frequency. The final sortie, Lieutenant Jerry Yellin. The story of the Mustang over Japan reached its poignant conclusion on August 14, 1945. Lieutenant Jerry Yellin, a pilot of the 78th Fighter Squadron, took off from Iwo Jima for what would be the final combat mission of World War II. As he strafed airfields near Nagoya, the world below him was already in the process of surrender. When Yellin returned to his base and climbed out of his cockpit, he was met with the news that the war was over. In a cruel twist of fate, his wingman, 19-year-old Philip Schlamberg, had disappeared during that final mission, becoming the last American combat death of the conflict. When Yellin looked at his Mustang that evening, the world had fundamentally shifted. The era of the reciprocating engine fighter was at its zenith, and the dawn of the jet age was already visible on the horizon. The mathematics of victory, production versus spirit. The P-51D Mustang over Tokyo remains the ultimate symbol of the age of the production line. It was the physical manifestation of a nation that could produce 15,000 top-tier aircraft while the rest of the world struggled to find spare parts. It proved a cold, hard truth that many military romanticists find difficult to accept, that courage, while noble and essential, is ultimately a finite resource that cannot overcome the inexorable mathematics of total industrial war. The Japanese had banked their entire survival on the divine wind and the warrior spirit of their pilots. But that spirit was silenced by the mechanical scream of the Merlin engine and the sheer volume of 100-octane fuel flowing from American refineries.
The technological gulf was so vast that the Japanese were essentially fighting a 20th century war with 19th century logistics. Legacy: the Mustang over Fuji. The image of the Mustang's silver silhouette banked against the cone of Mount Fuji is one of the most powerful icons of the 20th century. It represented the moment when distance was conquered, when the ocean was bridged, and when industrial might achieved a level of supremacy that resistance futile. The skies over Japan belonged definitively and forever to the Mustang. The aircraft didn't just win a war, it defined a new world order, where the laboratory and the assembly line were just as decisive as the cockpit. As the sun set on the empire of the rising sun, it rose on a world where American wings of aluminum and hearts of steel had proven that in the modern age, the impossible was simply a problem awaiting an engineering solution.